This 1913 photo of a nurse and patient looks tender until you see the tag. It had passed through dozens of hands before anyone noticed. The nurse stands proud in her starched white uniform. The patient, gaunt but composed, meets the camera with dignity. Everything about the image suggests care, progress, the modern mercy of early 20th century medicine, until you look at what is pinned to his blanket. Dr. Elena Castillo had been cataloging the Massachusetts Medical Archives photograph collection for 3 years when she found it. She was alone in the basement conservation lab on a January afternoon, the kind of gray Boston day where the light dies at 4 o'clock and the radiator hisses like something alive. The photo had come from an estate sale, part of a larger donation of hospital ephemera. Someone's grandmother had been a nurse at Boston City Hospital. When she died, her niece cleaned out the attic and called the university. Elena lifted the print carefully from its backing. 8 by 10 inches, albumin process, nicely preserved. The image showed a hospital ward with iron-framed beds lined up along both walls, high windows, white walls. The nurse, perhaps 30 years old, stood beside the third bed on the left. Her hand rested on a wooden clipboard. The patient was a man, maybe 40, with dark hair and hollow cheeks. His eyes were open but tired. A thin blanket covered him to the chest. She brought the magnifying glass closer. There, just visible where the blanket folded near his shoulder, a small metal tag. She adjusted the angle of her desk lamp. The tag was pinned through the fabric. It caught the light. 2 lines of text stamped in capital letters. The first line read, Ward C. The second line read, C Trial. Elena sat back. She had cataloged thousands of medical photographs. She knew ward designations. She knew patient identification systems. But she had never seen anything quite like this. A trial. A designation that turned a patient into a subject. And the way it was pinned there, visible but unremarked upon, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, BCH Ward C, Spring 1913, Dr. M. Study. Elena Castillo had spent her career at the intersection of medical history and visual culture. She had a Ph.D. in the history of medicine from Columbia and had worked at the National Library of Medicine before taking this position. She specialized in the Progressive Era, that bright, confident period when American medicine professionalized itself, built grand institutions, and promised scientific salvation. She knew what those promises had cost. But this was different. This was evidence in plain sight, preserved because no one had thought to hide it, or perhaps because no one had thought anyone would care. She scanned the photograph at high resolution and zoomed in on the tag. The metal was brass or bronze, the kind used for inventory or identification. The letters were clear, machine-stamped, Ward C Trial, not patient of Ward C, not participant in study, trial, as if the man himself were the experiment. She examined the rest of the image more carefully. The nurse's expression was composed, almost proud. Her uniform was spotless. The ward behind her was clean and orderly. But now that Elena looked closer, she could see other details. The patient's hands lay on top of the blanket, fingers slightly curled. His wrists were thin, very thin. And his eyes, which she had read at first as tired, now looked sunken, the kind of hollow that came from prolonged illness or starvation, or both. She flipped the photo again and studied the pencil notation. Dr. M. Study. The name was incomplete, either faded or deliberately abbreviated. But it was a start. Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her. She could catalog this image like any other, write a neutral description and move on. Or she could follow the thread. Once you saw something like this, really saw it, ignoring it felt like complicity. She pulled out her laptop and began. Boston City Hospital in 1913. She knew the institution. It had been founded in 1864 as the city's first municipal hospital, meant to serve the poor who could not afford private care. By the 1910s, it was one of the largest hospitals in New England. It treated thousands of patients every year, most of them immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe. People who arrived at the port with nothing and fell sick in the crowded tenements of the North End and South Boston. She found the hospital's annual reports, digitized and available through the state archives. The 1913 report listed a Ward C. It was designated as a general medical ward for adult male patients. Capacity, 40 beds. Average length of stay, 32 days. Mortality rate listed as within normal parameters. That phrase caught her attention. Within normal parameters. But no actual number. She searched for Der-M in the hospital's physician directory from 1913. 3 possibilities. Dr. Marcus Morrison, a senior attending physician. Dr. Martin McKee, a junior surgeon. Dr. Michael Mancini, listed as a clinical researcher with an affiliation to Harvard Medical School. She emailed a colleague, Dr. Paul Chen, who taught medical ethics at Boston University and specialized in the history of human experimentation. They had worked together before on a project about tuberculosis sanatoriums. He responded within an hour and agreed to meet the next day. Paul arrived at the archive with coffee and a leather satchel stuffed with photocopied articles. He was in his 50s, meticulous, and had the useful quality of never being shocked by anything. Elena showed him the photograph. He studied it for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "See, trial," he said. "That is not subtle." "Have you seen anything like this before?" Elena asked. "Tags? No, but this era?" He pulled out a folder. Charity hospitals were laboratories. Everyone knew it, but no one talked about it. Poor patients were considered educational material. Medical students practiced on them. Researchers tested treatments on them. The justification was that these people were getting free care, so they owed something in return. He spread several documents across the table. Medical journal articles from 1910 to 1920. Titles like Experimental Therapeutics in Municipal Hospital Settings and Observations on Drug Efficacy in Indigent Populations. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed in 1906, Paul said, but it focused on manufacturing standards, not human testing. There were no federal rules about informed consent. That concept barely existed. If you were poor and sick and in a charity hospital, you were essentially at the mercy of whoever was running the ward. Elena pointed to the patient in the photograph. "Can we find out who he was?" "Maybe. Depends on what records survived." Over the next 2 weeks, Elena worked through the archive systematically. She found the Boston City Hospital patient registries for 1913. Ward C had admitted 487 patients that year. Most stayed between 2 weeks and 2 months. The registry listed names, ages, nationalities, and diagnoses. The mortality column showed that 63 patients died in Ward C in 1913. That was a mortality rate of nearly 13%. For a general medical ward, that was high, very high. She cross-referenced the registry with the hospital's quarterly reports. In every public document, Ward C's mortality was described as within normal parameters or comparable to similar institutions, never an actual number. She found the entry for the man in the photograph. She was almost certain it was him, Giovanni Russo. Age 38, nationality Italian, admitted April 1913, diagnosis tuberculosis, transferred to Ward C from the general intake ward after 2 weeks, died June 1913, cause of death listed as respiratory failure secondary to tubercular infection. 2 months. He had been in that ward for 2 months. She found 23 other patients in the registry with similar patterns, all immigrants, all diagnosed with tuberculosis or pneumonia, all transferred to Ward C after initial intake, all died within 3 months. She requested personnel records and found Dr. Michael Mancini. He had joined Boston City Hospital in 1911, brought in as part of an initiative to establish clinical research partnerships with Harvard Medical School. His specialty was listed as experimental pharmacology. His funding came from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In a medical journal from 1914, she found an article authored by Mancini, Preliminary Observations on the Use of Arsphenamine Derivatives in Advanced Pulmonary Disease. Arsphenamine was a new drug related to salvarsan, which Paul Ehrlich had developed to treat syphilis. Mancini's article suggested the drug might have broader applications. It described trials conducted on a population of 47 subjects with chronic respiratory infections at an unnamed Boston hospital. The results section was vague. 32 subjects completed the trial. 15 subjects expired during the study period due to complications unrelated to treatment. 15 deaths, and they were called unrelated to treatment. But Giovanni Russo's death certificate said respiratory failure. Arsphenamine was known to cause severe reactions, Anaphylaxis, organ damage, respiratory distress. Elena called Paul again. He came back to the archive, this time with a medical historian named Dr. Sarah Okafor, who had written extensively about immigrant health in early 20th century cities. Sarah looked at the registry and the journal article and shook her head. This is a pattern. Tuberculosis patients were perfect subjects for drug trials. They were already dying. If the drug killed them, you could blame the disease. And immigrants? She tapped the registry. No one was checking. No one was following up. If Giovanni Russo died, who would complain? His family probably did not even speak English. Elena found the photographer's stamp on the back of another image from the same estate sale. Whitman Studios, Boston. A commercial photographer who did contract work for institutions. Hospitals often hired photographers to document new facilities, staff, and sometimes patients. The images were used in fundraising materials, annual reports, public relations. The photograph of Giovanni Russo and the nurse had been staged to show care, modernity, progress. Look at our clean wards, our professional staff, our patients resting comfortably. The tag on his blanket was visible because no one thought it mattered, or because they thought it added to the image of scientific rigor. He was not just a patient, he was part of a study, part of the future of medicine, but he had not consented. He probably had not even understood what was happening. Elena requested funding from the archive to travel to the former site of Boston City Hospital, now part of Boston Medical Center. The original buildings were mostly gone, but the medical center maintained a small historical collection. She wanted to see if there were more records, more photographs, any trace of Ward C beyond what the state archive held. The medical center's archivist, an older man named Tom Breslin, met her in a storage room full of file boxes. He had worked there for 30 years and remembered when parts of the old hospital were still standing. Ward C, he said, flipping through an index. That was in Building 3, torn down in the 1970s, but we have some administrative files. He pulled a box from a high shelf. Donor records mostly. Building 3 was funded by a private endowment. Inside the box, Elena found correspondence from 1910 to 1920 between the hospital administration and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The letters discussed funding for a clinical research initiative designed to improve therapeutic outcomes for indigent populations. The state provided annual grants. In return, the hospital was required to submit quarterly reports demonstrating effective use of resources. One letter, dated December 1913, stood out. It was from the hospital's superintendent to the state's commissioner of health. It acknowledged concerns raised by nursing staff regarding patient outcomes in Ward C, but assured the commissioner that all procedures follow accepted medical practice and that mortality rates remain within expected ranges given the severity of presenting illnesses. Nursing staff had raised concerns. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She asked Tom if there were any nursing records, personnel files, anything from that period. He brought out another box. Inside were employment records and a few personal papers donated by a nurse's family in the 1980s. One folder contained letters written by a nurse named Catherine O'Brien, who had worked at Boston City Hospital from 1911 to 1915. In a letter dated May 1913, Catherine wrote to her sister, "I'm troubled by what I see in Ward C. The patients there are very sick, yes, but they are given medicines that make them sicker still. Dr. M insists it is necessary for the study, but I have seen 3 men die this month alone, and their suffering at the end was terrible. I asked the head nurse if we might speak to the families, but she said the families have no say in treatment decisions. That is the price of charity care." Elena photographed the letter. This was evidence, direct testimony. A nurse who saw what was happening and was troubled by it, but had no power to stop it. She found one more document in Tom's archive. A financial ledger from 1914. It showed the hospital had received $50,000 in state funding that year, contingent on the success of the Ward C therapeutic research program. In modern terms, that was over $1 million. The program was a revenue stream, and if the mortality rate became public, if donors or the state legislature realized how many patients were dying, the funding would disappear. So the administration hid the numbers. They reported mortality as within normal parameters. They framed deaths as inevitable outcomes of severe disease. They didn't count the patients who died from drug reactions, organ failure, shock. They didn't ask for consent because consent was not required. And they did not tell the families because the families, mostly immigrant families who spoke limited English and had no legal standing, were not considered stakeholders. Elena spent weeks tracing what happened to the other 23 patients she had identified. Some had family records in church archives. The North End's Catholic churches kept meticulous baptism and death records. She found Giovanni Russo's name in the registry of St. Leonard's Church. He had arrived in Boston in 1908. He worked as a stonemason. He had a wife, Anna, and 2 children. When he died, the church recorded it as consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. No mention of a hospital trial, no indication that his death was anything other than a sad but ordinary tragedy. Sarah Okafor helped Elena connect Ward C to a broader national context. This was not unique to Boston, Sarah said. They were sitting in Elena's office, surrounded by printouts and scanned documents. Charity hospitals across the country were doing this. Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Anywhere you had large immigrant populations and teaching hospitals, you had unregulated experimentation. The justification was always the same. These people were getting care they could not afford, so they should be grateful. And if they died, well, they were already sick. She pulled up an article on her laptop. In 1906, Dr. Hideo Noguchi infected charity patients in New York with syphilis to test a diagnostic serum. In 1913, the same year as your photograph, Dr. Leo Stanley at San Quentin Prison was transplanting animal testicles into prisoners to test theories about rejuvenation. None of this was illegal. It was just medicine. Elena paused. But someone must have objected. Someone must have tried to stop it. Some did, Sarah said. There were reformers, journalists, a few doctors and nurses, but the medical establishment closed ranks. They said critics were anti-science, sentimental, ignorant, and the hospitals had powerful allies, universities, philanthropic foundations, state governments that wanted to appear modern and progressive. Paul Chen added another layer. And race mattered, so did class. Ward C patients were not just poor, they were foreign. That made them less than full citizens in many people's eyes. The idea was that their bodies could be used for the greater good, to advance knowledge, to train doctors, to develop treatments that would eventually help real Americans. Elena felt the weight of it. Giovanni Russo had been a person, a man with a name, a family, a trade. But to Dr. Mancini and the hospital administration, he had been material, a body on which to test a hypothesis, and when he died, they had recorded it as a data point and moved on. She decided to go public, not just with an academic article, but with something bigger. She contacted a journalist named Marcus Ellison, who covered health policy for the Boston Globe. She showed him the photograph, the registry, the nursing letters, the financial ledgers. He was interested immediately. But Elena's institution was not. When the director of the Massachusetts Medical Archive, Dr. Helen Travers, learned that Elena was planning to work with the Globe, she called an emergency meeting. Elena, Paul, Sarah, and Tom Breslin sat in a conference room with Helen and 2 members of the archive's board of directors. Helen began carefully. I want to be clear that no one here questions the historical importance of Dr. Castillo's research, but we need to consider how this story will be received. Boston City Hospital is now Boston Medical Center. It is a major institution. It serves vulnerable populations. If we publish allegations of historical abuse, there could be consequences. These are not allegations, Elena said. These are facts, documented facts. One of the board members, a lawyer named Richard Kwan, spoke up. I understand, but we need to think about liability. If descendants of these patients decide to sue, the medical center could argue that the archive's publication constitutes evidence of institutional knowledge. That could complicate things legally. Paul shook his head. The statute of limitations expired decades ago. No one is suing anyone. Maybe not, Richard said. But there are other concerns. Donors, partnerships. The archive receives funding from several medical institutions. If we publish something that damages Boston Medical Center's reputation, those relationships could suffer. Sarah leaned forward. So we should stay silent? Protect institutions that exploited and killed people? I'm not saying that, Richard said. I'm saying we need to be strategic. Maybe we publish an academic article, something in a specialized journal. That way we are on the record, but it does not become a media spectacle. Elena felt anger rising. Giovanni Russo was not a spectacle. He was a man who died because a hospital used him as a test subject without his consent. His family never knew. They thought he died of tuberculosis, which was true, but they did not know he was given experimental drugs that probably accelerated his death, and there were dozens more like him. This is not about protecting reputations, it is about telling the truth. Tom Breslin, who had been quiet, spoke up. I worked at the medical center for 30 years. I know people there, good people, doctors and nurses who care deeply about their patients. But that does not mean we hide what happened a century ago. If anything, being honest about the past makes the institution stronger. It shows that medicine has learned, that we do not do this anymore because we know it was wrong. Helen looked at Tom, then at Elena. She was silent for a long moment. If we move forward with this, we need to do it right. We need to involve the community, the North End Italian community, the families, if we can find them. This cannot just be an academic exercise. Elena nodded. That is what I want. I want Giovanni Russo's family to know what happened to him. I want them to be part of this story. The meeting ended without a final decision, but Helen agreed to let Elena continue working with the Globe, provided that the archive's name was included as a partner in the research and that the medical center was given advance notice of the article's publication. Over the next month, Elena and Marcus Ellison worked together. Marcus tracked down descendants of several Ward C patients through genealogy databases and church records. One of them was Rosa Marino, the great-granddaughter of Giovanni Russo. She lived in Revere, just north of Boston. She had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather, the stonemason who died young, but no one in the family knew he had been in a medical trial. When Marcus and Elena met with Rosa and showed her the photograph, she cried. "He looks so tired," she said. "But I never knew. My grandmother, his daughter, she only remembered that he got sick and went to the hospital and never came back." Elena explained what they had found. The trial, the drugs, the mortality rate, the cover-up. Rosa listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They used him," she said finally, "because he was poor, because he was Italian, because they could." "Yes," Elena said. Rosa looked at the photograph again. "What happens now?" "We tell the story," Marcus said. "We publish it. We make sure people know what happened." Rosa nodded slowly. "Good. Because he was a person. He had a name. He had a family. He should not just be forgotten." The Boston Globe published the article in March, a full year after Elena first found the photograph. The headline read, "Hidden in Plain Sight, How Boston City Hospital Experimented on Immigrant Patients Without Consent." The article included the photograph. It included Giovanni Russo's name. It included the registry data, the nursing letters, the financial ledgers. It quoted Elena, Paul, Sarah, and Tom. It quoted Rosa Marino. It laid out the system, how charity hospitals used poor patients as research subjects, how administrators hid mortality statistics to protect funding, how families were never told the truth. The response was immediate. Boston Medical Center issued a statement acknowledging the article's findings and apologizing to the families of patients who had been harmed. The statement said the hospital would work with historians to review other historical records and would establish a memorial to patients who had been subjected to unethical research. Several other hospitals in Massachusetts followed suit. They opened their archives. They invited researchers to investigate. Some found similar patterns: trials without consent, experimental treatments on vulnerable populations, deaths attributed to underlying disease when drugs were the real cause. The Massachusetts Medical Archive worked with Rosa Marino and other descendants to create a small exhibition. It was called Subjects, Immigrant Patients, and Medical Experimentation in Progressive-Era Boston. The centerpiece was the photograph of Giovanni Russo. Beside it, the exhibition included his church records, his death certificate, excerpts from Catherine O'Brien's letters, and a timeline showing how his death fit into the larger pattern. The exhibition text was clear. This photograph was intended to show progress, a modern hospital, professional care. But the tag on Giovanni Russo's blanket tells a different story. It marks him as a subject in an unregulated medical trial. He didn't consent. He likely didn't even understand what was being done to him. When he died, the hospital recorded it as an inevitable outcome of disease, not as a consequence of experimental treatment. His family was never told the truth. This photograph is evidence of a system that treated poor immigrants not as patients with rights, but as material for scientific advancement. Rosa Marino attended the opening. She brought her children and grandchildren. They stood in front of Giovanni Russo's photograph for a long time. Elena watched from across the room. She thought about how images could be read and misread, how they could hide and reveal, how a single detail, a tag pinned to a blanket, could unlock a story that had been buried for a century. Paul Chen gave a talk at the exhibition. He pointed out that Ward C was not an aberration. This was standard practice, he said. Across the country, thousands of poor patients, many of them immigrants, many of them people of color, were used in medical experiments without consent. We remember the Tuskegee syphilis study, but that was just one case. There were hundreds more. And we only know about them because people like Dr. Castillo refused to look away. A photograph is never just a photograph. It is a staged moment, a choice about what to show and what to hide. The nurse in Giovanni Russo's photograph stands proud. The ward is clean. The patient rests beneath a white blanket. Everything about the image says care, progress, modernity, everything except the tag. How many other photographs hang in archives, museums, and family albums with details we have not yet seen? How many smiling doctors and nurses, respectable institutions, proud moments of medical advancement are actually evidence of exploitation, experimentation, violence? The camera does not lie, but it does not tell the whole truth either. It captures what someone wants us to see. Giovanni Russo's tag was visible because no one thought to hide it, or because they thought no one would care, or because, in 1913, using poor immigrants as test subjects was so ordinary, so accepted, that marking them with a metal tag seemed perfectly reasonable. Now we know better. We have laws, ethics boards, informed consent. But that knowledge came at a cost. It came from people like Giovanni Russo, who suffered and died so that doctors could test their theories and hospitals could secure their funding. And it came from people like Catherine O'Brien, the nurse who wrote to her sister and said, "I am troubled by what I see." People who saw the truth and refused to stay silent, even when staying silent would have been easier. Elena Castillo still works at the Massachusetts Medical Archive. The photograph of Giovanni Russo hangs on the wall of her office. She keeps it there as a reminder to look closely, to ask questions, to refuse easy answers. Because every photograph, no matter how ordinary it seems, is evidence. Evidence of someone's life, someone's suffering, someone's resistance, someone's truth. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen.